In this lesson, we'll take a detailed look at the light parameters. So we're going to grab the area light that we just created in the previous lesson. So I'm going to open up the outliner. Just in case you didn't know, the Maya 2017 has got this new button which will bring up the outliner even if it's open somewhere else. So it's really handy, really good feature. So you just open this up and then we can grab the area light there. And then let's just open up a Arnold render view. And let's just make that a bit bigger. So just maximize this. Maybe close this, and let's just see the real size here. Okay, so here we are. And so let's have a look at these parameters. So working our way down here. So the first parameter we've got is color, and you can obviously change the color here, and you'll see the results there as well. And you can map that with an image, and it's going to show you what you've mapped. So let's try changing this to ramp and change it to rainbow. Just going to update the scene. Sometimes if you've changed the texture or updated the texture, you have to go to render update scene or Control U or Apple U, and now you can see that the ramp is showing there. Okay, I'm just going to disconnect that. I'm just going to go back to the area light here. Just break that connection. Okay, just reset this by changing it to black and then bring it up to white. And again, we'll have to re-export this scene, update full scene. Okay, so moving on down, we've got intensity. And intensity just works in the same way as a regular Maya light. You can just increase it to increase the intensity and lower it to decrease the intensity. Now, you can map this as well with something. With exposure, it's slightly different. So exposure is exponential, so it's basically every time you increase it by 1, it's going to double the light. So it's measured in f-stops, just like in real photography. And so it's designed to help you interact with real cinematographers. So for example, when I was working on Gravity, the cinematographer or the director of photography would come in and he would say, oh, could we increase that by half a stop or whatever? And you can just increase this by half a stop and then you would get the result that you want. So it's just a nice way of interacting with real world units, basically. There's no difference between these two except this number will be smaller to increase the intensity. So you can see this is on 13 roughly, and this is on 1.1, and this is how it looks. So let's just keep a snapshot. And then I'm going to show you, if I change this to 13, and then this to 1, you can see it's really dark. So that just shows you that this will be a lot lower number. So it might be handy if you don't like to have large numbers on your intensity. Sometimes that can reach like 10,000 or whatever. It doesn't really bother me. And the advantage of also using intensity is that if you look in the viewport, just going to minimize this for a second. If you look in the viewport here and turn on lights, you can actually see the intensity there. If I were to use exposure, if I change this to 1, change this to 13, you can see it doesn't actually show in the viewport. Okay, it will render correctly, but it doesn't show in the viewport. So if you do like to use the viewport for lighting your scene and just seeing a quick preview of it, because the new viewport 2.0 is pretty cool. So just bear in mind that the exposure doesn't work like that. So I'm just going to change that to 1, and I'll just increase this, and now I can see it in the viewport, which is quite handy. So I'll just increase that to maybe more than that, maybe. We'll see what that looks like in the render view. Okay, still not bright enough. Change it to 500, 1000. A bit better, 7,000. So you can see the equivalent is something like this, which is like 7,000. And this is my previous snapshot that I took, and that's with a intensity of 1 and exposure of 13. So you can see the difference there. I'll just turn this off. Okay, so this is what we've got at the moment. So moving on down, we've got color temperature, and that just changes the color based on the Kelvin scale. So the lower it is, the hotter the light will be. You're getting into the temperature of something like candlelight there, and then as you go up, you're going into skylight, so blue light from the sky. So this is measured in kelvins. So if you want to enter that, you can. I'm just going to turn that off. Then we've got the regular Maya controls for illuminates by default. This is to do with light linking. So if I turn this off, if you look in the viewport, you can see it goes completely black. That means that the lights will not be affected by it. And if I were to update this scene, it should update that effect. So update full scene. You can see it's black now. And all that does is unlink the light from everything. And then if you want to link the specific objects you want, you can select the light and the objects that you want to link, for example, like that. And then you can go to rendering, light linking, or lighting and shading, excuse me, and then make light links. So now that those light links are made, you should be able to see those in the viewport, in the render, excuse me. There you go. Okay, so light linking works in the regular Maya way. So I'm just going to turn that back on so that it affects everything. And then we've got emit, diffuse, and emit specular. So we can not affect the specular or not affect the diffuse. As you can see, if I turn it off, it's going to go extremely dark. And that just works in the regular Maya way. All lights are quadratic by default, so they fall off at a quadratic rate, the realistic rate, using the inverse square law. I would recommend that you don't change that. So that's what makes nice realistic renders, where you get nice shading going from light to dark. And if you have this constant, you're just going to have a flat color, which is not very good. So we'll just change this to quadratic. Obviously, if you did change it to constant, you would need to turn this intensity down a lot, because it doesn't fall off. So let's take a look at the shape here, and you can change the shape of your light. So you can see it here. Let me just go to perspective so maybe you can see this a bit better. So there's our light there, and you can see it's a square, and this is called a quad. We can change that to a disc, which looks like that, and then you can change it to a cylinder, which looks like that. Okay, and you can scale this to whatever you want to. And the shape of this will appear in the reflection of your object. So these glasses here will have the reflection of this shape in white inside them. So the most common ones that I use are disc. So you can use these for little spotlights, for example, in interior scenes, and they'll show up as little round things, little round white dots in the reflections. And then you've got the quad here, which is great for windows and things like that, where you'll need a square or a rectangular surface. This resolution basically is to do with the texture that you put in here, and it's to do with importance sampling. So importance sampling is the way the computer deals with images that you apply to your lighting, and what it will do is it will split that image up and look for the brightest parts and sample those more, whereas the darker parts, it won't sample them as much because they won't contribute to the render. So this is the resolution that you're going to use to control that. So if you had an image in here, so I'm just going to update this. Let's just go to update full scene so it gets back to regular. There we go. So let's move down to samples. This is one of the most important parameters on light. This is going to affect the quality of the light, the quality of the shadows more specifically, and also it's going to affect the render time. So the higher this number is, the slower it's going to be. And this is an override, so you've got a global setting for samples, which we'll look at in detail later. But this is where you go to increase the quality. So if you look at these shadows here, you can see that they're grainy. If I turn on region render and then pick this area, just so it goes a little bit quicker, I could increase this, and you can see that that grain would disappear. Okay, so that's how you increase the quality. Now, I would encourage you to work at a low samples when you're just tweaking the scene so that it works nice and quickly and you can see the entire scene. If you increase this too much too early, it's going to be pretty slow to update. So I'm just going to put that back down to 1. You can see if it's 0, it will be black. Just change it to 1, and there we go, back to normal. So let's talk about normalizing this little tick box here. So what this means is that if I scale up my light, I'm going to get the same amount of light, and it's not going to change, so the intensity won't change. So let's just have a look at this. I'm just going to close this for a second, And I'm just going to use a regular render, so I'll just render this the way it is now. So I'll just press this button here and just render it the way it is now. If you're not getting the right view, just make sure you right click on this and say shot cam, and we'll just keep this. Okay, and then if we scale this down, you can see in the viewport it's actually getting less light, but if we look in here and render it, you can see the only thing that changes is the shadow. So if you look at the shadow here and the lighting, the wraparound lighting, you can see it's a lot softer before here and over here, and you can see that the shadows are sharper. Okay, so that's one thing that I want you to notice about area lights in the first place. The bigger they are, the softer result you get, the softer shadows you get, and the nicer lighting. And obviously if you're going to be going for a nice soft effect, then you're going to make it nice and big and have these soft shadows that model these objects nicely, so you get nice wraparound lighting. And if you don't want that, if you want harsher lighting for kind of certain scenes that you might want that for, you want to make this smaller. But you can see that the intensity doesn't change. So this intensity does not change, and this is the same brightness. If I were to turn this off, it means that the scale would have an effect. So the smaller I have this, the darker it's going to get as well. So it won't just affect the shadows, it's going to make this darker as well. So this is how it looked before, and if I render it now, you can see it looks brighter, but that's because normalize was off before. So if I look at this, if I keep this and scale it up, it's going to look even more brighter. So let's have a look. You can see it's completely white. So scale now has an effect. So the bigger the light is, the more light it will give off. The smaller the light is, the less light it will give off. Now that does sound intuitive, but when you're working, generally you're just working visually. And the reason this normalizes on by default is because it's more intuitive. So normally you would just adjust the intensity to have a nice result, and then you might scale this up and down to get a nice soft shadow on it. So rather than messing around with the size to increase the intensity, you just use the intensity. So personally, I just leave this on by default, but I just wanted you to know what it does. Okay, and then we've got cast shadows, so let's just have a quick look at that. And as you can imagine, if you turn that off, you're not going to get any shadows here. Just give that a quick render. In fact, maybe just open up the Arnold render view, it's a bit quicker, and turn that back on. I have to update the scene. There we go. Okay, and then you can pick the color as well, so you can make that blue if you wanted to in certain circumstances. If you're making a stylized render, for example, you can update that. There we go. Okay, I'm just going to leave that on black for now. So the next setting is Effect Volumetrics, and as the name implies, it means that it's going to light up any volumes that you've got in your scene. So the volumes are in order to get haze and fog and that nice kind of God lighting that you get from Steven Spielberg films, for example, and you want the light to light that up. So if you don't want that effect, you can turn it off, because a lot of the time you put in quite a few lights to have some fill light around the edge. Let's say this is a bit too dark, you might put a light here just to fill that in, but you don't necessarily want that to light up the fog and light up the haze. So you could just turn this off, and volumetric lighting is quite expensive in terms of render time. So if you turn that off and just leave it to the minimum number of lights, then it's going to go a bit quicker as well. And then this is whether it casts shadows in that volumetric light, so you get those nice, as I say, God rays. And if you don't want those, you can turn those off, and it's going to be a lot quicker to render. Okay. Sometimes you just want a bit of haze in the background, and you don't want it to calculate all the shadows because it takes ages to do that. So you can just turn that off. So you've got a separate slider for volume samples, and again, that's for samples inside things like fog. You can turn this up and down to get rid of the graininess inside the fog. So you've got individual sliders for the different shading. So we've got diffuse, so if I was to turn this down, let me just press play here, there we go. If I turn this down, you can see that affects the diffuse. There is no specular in the scene, there is no shaders in the scene that have got specular, so this won't have any effect. But if I had something like a blin in here, it would turn down the effect of the highlight. And then this is the subsurface scattering. Indirect should work. So if I turn this off, there's no bounce lighting now. This is just the harsh direct light, and you can see it looks similar to the viewport because there's no bounce lighting. And then if you turn on indirect, you can see the bounce lighting there. This is good for diagnostics as well, or if you're trying to tweak your lighting and you don't want too much bounce light, you can just turn this down a little bit, and then you can see you've got less fill light there. So you can see that you've got less fill light, and you can tweak that, which is quite handy. And then this is whether it affects any volumes, just like we were saying there, so we can turn it up and down and see how it affects the fog. So this setting here is the number of bounces, and you can change the number of bounces. I never really do that, but for example, if I change this to 1, if I change this to 0, you shouldn't have any bounce lighting. There you go. So you see the effect of what it does. If I say 2, you're going to have a little bit more. Let's see if there's any difference between 1 and 2. Normally this has a bigger effect in terms of indoor scenes, because you want indoor scenes to bounce the light around a bit more. So these are the parameters for the lights, and these are the same parameters that are in all the different light types, and we'll just have a look at those light types in the next lesson.